Mnemonics are clever memory techniques that can be used to memorize everything from decks of cards to speeches. But how do you use them to learn Chinese? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about how to use mnemonics to learn Chinese. This is a follow-up to episode 293, Remembering is a skill you can learn, mnemonics for Chinese learners. The main takeaway from that episode is that your memory can be trained and that there are several techniques you can use to better memorize things and recall them later. You don't have to have listened to that episode to make sense of this one, but for a general introduction to the topic of memory techniques and mnemonics, I suggest you tune into episode 293. As usual, I will also put links to articles and episodes that I mention in the show notes. Memorizing Chinese characters is one of the best applications of mnemonics in all of language learning, and this is because in Chinese most things mean something. If we take a standard two-syllable word, each of these syllables usually represent a character and this character means something. And if we look at these characters, most characters are compounds, so the components in these compounds also mean something. In some cases, even compound characters have components that in themselves are compounds that you can break down and understand. The point I'm trying to make is that because this is so transparent and easy to see, it is also very easy to use mnemonics to learn Chinese characters and words. It's not only that most things are compounds, however, it's also the fact that these building blocks that make up these compounds recur in other compounds. So if you learn the building blocks of this character or this word, the building blocks you learn will come back and you will be able to use them to memorize other characters and words later. This does not necessarily mean that you should always learn all the building blocks of every character or word you learn, but those that recur often you should learn, and the most common ones recur hundreds of times. For this to work though, you need to understand the basic structure of the characters you're learning. There are several traps here that beginners often fall into, and so let's have a look at two examples to illustrate what I mean. One problem is when you ascribe meaning to a component based only on its appearance in the specific character you happen to be learning. An example I often bring up here is an image of a boy eating an ice cream to memorize the character 吃, to eat. This character has a square on the left, which could be drawn as an ice cream then, and the right side of the character would be the boy's nose and mouth. This is not a bad image to use if your goal is to learn only this character. However, to learn to read and write Chinese, you need thousands of characters, and this component, which actually means mouth and is pronounced kou, is one of the most common building blocks. You could of course think of an ice cream every time you see this component and use that when memorizing other compounds as well, but this seems a bit daft considering that it means opening or entrance, and this is also the meaning it gives to many of the compounds that it's in. If you listen to episode 293 about the basic of mnemonics and memory techniques, this would be an example of a peg, but it would be a completely unnecessary one. We don't need a peg here because this component actually means something, and using that real meaning is just much better. The other example I want to bring up is ignoring the fact that some characters are compounds and looking at them as an image instead. For example, you might memorize the character yin, meaning reason, as a tent with flaps. It kind of looks like a tent, and this image might help you recall it if you have a dictation test next week. The problem is that this character consists of two components which are themselves fairly useful to know. First, in the middle, we have a person with outstretched arms, which usually means big in modern Mandarin, and then surrounding that we have a character that usually means just that, surrounding something or wall or enclosure. Both these are very useful to know and occur in many characters, so ignoring the structure of this character and treating it as a unit effectively hides the building blocks and makes subsequent characters harder to learn. This does not mean that you always have to dig all the way down and learn everything about every single character you want to learn, and if you did that in this case, you would actually realize that yin is not a compound originally. It started out as looking quite different from what it does today. But that doesn't really matter for our purposes here. The fact that it looks like a compound and has two identifiable components is good enough. So the reason I wanted to talk about building blocks before we talk about mnemonics is because once you've learned your first few characters and you're no longer a pure beginner, you will realize that learning characters is largely about combining things you already know. Sure, you will encounter some components you haven't seen before, but you will also see many components that you have already seen in other characters that you've learned. Once you've reached the intermediate stage, learning new characters is almost never about learning something entirely new, and almost always about combining building blocks you've seen somewhere else. And this is why mnemonics are so powerful for learning Chinese characters. I should say that I'm talking about Chinese characters here because I do think, as I said, that Chinese characters is one of the best applications of mnemonics in all of language learning, but we can of course use mnemonics to learn tones and pronunciation and many other things too. I have articles about these things on Hacking Chinese as well, and for more you can check the links in the show notes. Now we're going to go into some more detail on how to construct mnemonics that work. As discussed briefly in the earlier episode, you should create your own mnemonics. They are highly individual, and something that works for someone else might not work for you, and vice versa. So don't just download somebody else's mnemonics or copy them wholesale. Instead, make your own, and feel free to find inspiration in what others have done, but don't copy what they do. So how do you create associations between building blocks and their meanings so that you remember them long term? Well, there are a few principles that you can rely on, and as I also mentioned in that earlier episode, things that stick out, that your brain thinks are unusual or worth paying attention to, is a good place to start. I'll mention 3 examples here, but there are many more ways of making your brain pay attention. The first one is being absurd, and this is my favorite. The more exaggerated the association is, the easier it is to remember. Logic and reasonableness are not your friends here. If you want to remember the character yang, meaning ocean, don't picture a sheep next to some water, even if those are the building blocks of that character. Instead, use the exaggerated image from the earlier episode. A giant sheep with dripping wet wool wading across the Atlantic Ocean. The next principle is to make the association shameful or embarrassing. This works particularly well when related to different kinds of taboos. So for example, sex can be great, and purely from a language learning perspective of course, but many people report that shameful or embarrassing images tend to stick longer. The third principle is that funny associations can last longer. Use humor whenever you can, it's fun and funny things are easier to remember. One of my favorite mnemonics is remembering the traditional character ji, to covet or long for, by picturing myself seeing my neighbor's huge mountain of beans and coveting what he has. Because, as the saying goes, the other man's bean mountain is always taller. Naturally, nothing stops you from combining principles, so absurd things are often funny, and exaggerating something shameful often makes it more so. And pro tip, you don't have to share your mnemonics with anyone. But I think you can see why mnemonics need to be personal here. You might not find my sense of humor funny at all, you might find that my examples here are boring or dull, and then using those mnemonics to learn characters would be stupid. The principles I think apply to most people though, and as I said, there might be other ways to make things stand out, but as long as they stand out, they will be easier to remember. Next, I want to discuss an often overlooked aspect of using mnemonics to learn Chinese characters, or well, anything else for that matter. Namely, that your mnemonics should rely on the unique characteristics of the objects you are connecting. For example, compare these 2 ways of associating water and sheep in the character yang, ocean. 1. Picture an enormous sheep standing next to a pink ocean from which water trickles upwards into the air. 2. Picture an enormous sheep wading across the ocean. It's completely soaked and its wool drips with water and stinks. Both these mnemonics combine the same components, and they are also both absurd and exaggerated. However, the second is much more likely to stick because it relies on the unique characteristics of the element it contains. First, the sheep interacts with the ocean in a way that's unique to oceans. The sheep wades or swims through it. Second, the water has a direct effect on the sheep. Its wool is wet and stinky, and it probably looks goofy as a result. Third, the dripping water is the direct result of the interaction of the other 2 elements. Now, this was just an example, and it's not always easy to come up with 3-way associations where all parts interact like this, but it is a good idea to try and do this whenever you can. In other words, let the components interact with each other in a way that isn't generic. So let's have a look at 5 common components and see how they can interact with other components in a way that is unique to them. First out, we have shou, hand, which is of course extremely common as a component. It can slap things, grab things, drag things, and so on. Make it do things only hands can do. Next up, we have shan, mountain, which can squeeze things into pancakes or let objects crash onto its peaks. Next, we have shui, and I mean the vertical version here with 3 dots, which we already used in the example with ocean, but water can make things wet, so soaking wet that they drip, and this is also a good way to keep it separate from the full form of water, which can then represent larger amounts. Next up, we have fire, and now I mean the horizontal version, the 4 dots at the bottom of many characters, and this is great for putting a fire under things, literally, burn them up or down. And again, you can keep it separate from the full form of fire by letting that be a bonfire instead. The final example is kou, mouth, which is great for putting things in. This often results in bizarre or disgusting results without really trying. Chew it, taste it, eat it. So these were just a few principles and ideas for making associations stick in the long term and how to make mnemonics that really work. As mentioned, you should create your own mnemonics, and this requires a lot of trial and error. I have played around with mnemonics a lot, both when learning Chinese and when memorizing other things, so I know what works for me, but that, as I've mentioned, won't necessarily work for you. The principles are largely the same, but how you apply them, so for example, what you think is funny or absurd or shameful, is something that is entirely up to you and something you have to learn by experimenting. And don't worry too much if you find it hard to come up with exaggerated, absurd, or shameful images that stick. This is a skill you can learn. Before wrapping up, I'd like to warn against using mnemonics for everything. Once you've tried mnemonics and realized that they work quite well for some things, it's tempting to use mnemonics to memorize every single character you encounter, break down every single character into its smallest components and learn those, and then do the same thing for pronunciation and tones and so on. The problem here isn't that it won't work, but that it will take too much time, and this time can be much better invested into more listening and reading, as well as other things you should do as a learner of Chinese. Use mnemonics when something is hard to commit to memory or you seem to be forgetting the same character over and over. Mnemonics are a great weapon to have in your arsenal, but use them wisely. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.